Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dana Wiesner, and on behalf of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County, I'm so glad to welcome you to Exploring Israel's Diversity Through Popular Culture with Rich Walter. A special welcome to the new faces joining us today. Our Federation Live virtual programs are among the many ways we have been reaching out to bring our Jewish community together over the past couple of months. And at the same time, our Federation is also working to meet the rising critical needs of our people here in Israel and beyond. Through our annual campaign, our Federation's funding from more than 70 partner agencies here in Israel and around the world enables us to respond immediately in times like these. With our Federation's vital support, our agencies on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis are able to continue, adapt, and increase their care for those most vulnerable in the face of unprecedented challenges. While some aspects of our community are partially opening for business, the numbers of our neighbors who need help will continue to rise and persist for some time. Every donation of any size makes a difference, and we would love to include you in our annual campaign. After our program, we'll mail you some information to learn more about us and how to help, along with more great virtual opportunities to connect. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, your microphone is muted now for the presentation, but you will have the ability to ask questions during our Q&A time afterward. In addition, you can adjust the way your screen appears. If you'd like to view the person who's speaking or asking a question, please select Speaker View at the top of the Zoom screen. Now it is my privilege to introduce our presenter, Rich Walter. Rich Walter is the Vice President of Curriculum and Outreach at the Center for Israel Education and Associate Director for Israel Education at the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel at Emory University. Rich has had extensive experience increasing community involvement in Jewish formal and informal learning for a wide variety of age groups. He served as Director for Jewish Life and Learning at the Jewish Federation and Jewish Community Center of Greater New Haven, Director of Education and Community Development at the Bureau of Jewish Education in Rhode Island, and he taught at the Solomon Schechter School in Providence, Rhode Island. He was educated at Brandeis University, where he received his BA and MA degrees, focusing on Jewish history, Middle Eastern history, and Judaic studies. Rich, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today, and the Zoom is all yours.
Thanks, Dana, and thank you everyone for joining today. I think this should be a really interesting conversation. We're going to look at really a lot about Israeli society. I have some data that I'm happy to share with you, as well as some video clips. So I'm going to start right now by just getting my presentation up. Give me 1 second. And there we go. So again, today's topic is exploring Israel's diversity through popular culture. I'm sure that everyone knows that Israel is both a Jewish and democratic state, and oftentimes those two issues can come into conflict with each other as well as complement each other. One of the things that it's really important to understand is that Israel's diversity is in many different ways. And just in terms of understanding that diversity, this is the most recent population statistics for Israel society. Every year prior to Yom HaAtzmaut, the Central for Bureau of Statistics in the country actually releases some of the current demography. And so on Yom HaAtzmaut, which was just a few days ago, and actually today is the English anniversary of the signing of the proclamation of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948. But this is Israel's makeup. The population stands at just over 9 million. 78% of Israel's population is, of course, Jewish, and that's 6.81 million citizens. 21% is Arab, and about 0.5% are what are considered others. These are, for example, non-Jewish spouses of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, as well as other foreign people in the country. Another note just on the Arab population that I think is important to note, when we talk about the Arab population of 1.93 million, that doesn't include all citizens of Israel. Within that number are approximately 325,000 Arab residents of both Jerusalem or Druze who live in the Golan Heights, who have the status in Israel of permanent residents and not citizens. In other words, they are allowed to vote in municipal elections. So when the Jerusalem municipal city elections take place for mayor and city council, the residents of East Jerusalem are eligible to vote. And just last year, or about a year and a half ago, were the first municipal elections in the Golan Heights for the Druze who live there. But they are not citizens. They do not vote in Knesset elections. So if we were to take that out, when we talk about citizenry, we're talking about 20%. And while that number has certainly grown since Israel's inception in 1948, its percentage of Israel's population has remained fairly steady. However, when we're also talking about diversity, we also have to understand that within Israel's Jewish community, there is tremendous religious diversity, both in terms of religious practice, but also in terms of nation of origin. And we're going to talk a little bit about that for the first phase, where we're going to focus on that Jewish diversity. What I've presented here are the results of two of the more recent surveys that have asked Israelis to identify their religiosity. This is Israeli Jews, to identify their religiosity. In the orange is the Pew survey of Israeli society from 2015. And in the and in the gray is the American Jewish Committee's annual survey of Israeli society, which was done last year. So you can see that there's one question that was a little bit different. But when we look at the religious spectrum of the identity of Israel's Jews, you can see that about somewhere between 8 to 10%, I've also seen estimates as high as 12%, would be the Haredi. This is the ultra-Orthodox population. Another 10 to 12% or so are considered religious Zionists. They would be identified by their knit kippot, or the kippah sruga, as it's called. And then you see sort of a blending of people who would say that they are religious traditional, not that religious traditional, or secular. And this, of course, makes up the bulk of Israeli society. So when someone says that they're religious traditional, that could mean a lot of things. It could mean that they consider themselves to be religious and that the synagogue that they don't go to is Orthodox. Or it could just be that they belong to one of the other streams of Judaism, the Masorti or conservative movement, or the Reform movement within Israel. And of course, secular is the bulk of the Israeli population, of the Jewish population. When we talk about Jewish diversity, this is from an organization called Chidush, which at the end of 2019 puts out a religion and state index. And this is really important. When we think about Israeli society from here in the United States and in the diaspora, we tend to think that the biggest challenge that Israel faces is dealing with the Palestinian conflict or its regional conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict. But in fact, when Israelis are asked, what's the most important issue within Israeli society, here you can see that 72% view the tension in Israeli society between that secular group and the ultra-Orthodox as the harshest domestic tension or the second domestic tension. And this is much more acute than the tension between left and right politically. And we know how acute that is after we just went through 3 elections in about 18 months. It is also 4 times more acute than the tensions between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews and between rich and poor. So when we're looking at domestic issues, this is the biggest tension within Israeli society. And part of that tension is, of course, related to the ultra-Orthodox place in Israeli society. the ultra-Orthodox, for the most part, don't recognize the state of Israel. They, of course, believe very strongly in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Just a few weeks ago, and I didn't include it here, but in one of the ultra-Orthodox newspapers that is published in Jerusalem at the beginning of the month, as Yom HaAtzmaut was approaching, there was an editorial that effectively said, we view our participation in the state as if we were participating in a co-op board of a community. In other words, we participate because there are things that we need the co-op board to provide for us, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily a recognition of the state. They participate in political life to make sure that their needs are met and the issues that are important to them, namely welfare funding as well as funding for their education systems. And so, of course, the topic today is, how do these issues play out in popular culture? Well, there's no better way to look at popular culture when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox than to start with a show that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, as it's become incredibly popular in the United States through Netflix, and that, of course, is Shtisel. And Shtisel, again, very fascinating window into ultra-Orthodox life. And just because Shtisel is very popular here in the United States, I don't want to leave behind that Shtisel is one of numerous shows that have appeared in Israeli popular culture over the past few years that provide windows into ultra-Orthodox life and society. Another very popular show a few years, in the last few years, was called Shabab Nakim. There have also been several movies that look at the ultra-Orthodox world as well. So we're going to start here with a little video clip. This is, of course, Michael Aloni, star of Shtisel, and some of you may also be familiar with When Heroes Fly, another Israeli show that's available on Netflix that we're not going to talk about. And I'm going to play a clip where Aloni discusses basically his idea and compares his participation in Shtisel and compares the show to the American show of Mad Men and how it provides a window into a world. In Mad Men's case, it's a time capsule, but in Shtisel's case, it's a community capsule into this particular time and place. So let's listen to Michael Aloni here.
Great example with Mad Men. I always, when I read the pages, I thought Sopranos and especially at the time, because I was watching Mad Men, and such a great series. And it resembles, in my mind, somehow the Shtisel in the way that it's just planted in that world. You know, the way that women were treated and the way that America was at the time and the way that people dressed at the time, walking here on Wall Street with you know, hats and smoking everywhere. The cultural difference between how we grew as human beings evolved and changed, but the series, well, it raises the questions of you know, time and what changed, but it's just about these people, and it's just placed in that time. And I think Shtisel, in a way, is the same, as it's just placed in that community. It's not trying to say something about that community. It's not looking to judge or raise the question of what we think about the ultra-Orthodox community. I think you said it yourself, people fell in love with this series, not because of the sexiness of mysterious closed community, even though it was even, you know, for me hard to accept how will people will want to watch it. It's not, as you said, Fauda or When Heroes Fly. It's not like a big action, a lot of, I don't know, you know, romantic sex scenes that you get on your regular screen.
So it's fascinating that for Aloni here, it's not so much about the window. It is about the window into the culture. But if it didn't have good writing and good acting, it wouldn't be a show that was compelling to us. But what's really interesting—
Great example with Mad Men.
Sorry, what's really interesting is to look at the impact that the program has had on Israeli society. And I just want to share with you these two quotes. One is from Daniel Tryman, writing in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And he writes again, for many Jewish viewers, I suspect, curiosity about our Haredi kin is a significant part of the show's attraction. We non-Haredi can appreciate that Haredim are connected to us, that they are in some sense our mishpacha, our family. Yet our connection to the Haredi world is attenuated by a profound religious chasm. Shtisel allows us to bridge that divide from the comfort of our couches. Shtisel allows the average Israeli who's completely cut off from the ultra-Orthodox world to see these as people, as humans, as fellow Jews. And to bring it home even further, this is J.J. Sussman from the Gesher Film Fund, which is an organization in Israel that actually produces and is committed to producing diverse content in Israeli arts and culture. And he talks about, and it's part of a larger article that appeared in Times of Israel. But Sussman here talks about the impact directly that Shtisel has had on the average Israeli. And he says, 3 years ago, I met with the head of human resources at a large high-tech company in Tel Aviv. I told her about our work with employers to help them learn about, understand, and integrate recruits from Haredi society. I explained the benefits of a diversified workforce and how this community could be a tremendous resource to help fill the labor shortage in her industry. After a bit of hesitation, she began to open up. She explained that she grew up on a kibbutz up north and never really interacted with the Haredim. But, she said, I recently watched Shtisel. If you can help me find Haredim like Kiva, I'd be interested. So this sense that for many Israelis, and one of the challenges that Israel's diversity has, is that these different groups don't necessarily interact with each other. If you're not living in Jerusalem, if you are growing up in a kibbutz on the north or in Haifa, although Haifa is a mixed Arab-Israeli city, you're not necessarily interacting on a day-to-day basis with people from other segments of Israeli society. And why this is so important, this last quote, is because socioeconomically, the Haredim are probably among the poorest segments of Israeli society. They greatly depend on welfare. The men in the families don't really work because they're, for the most part, learning in yeshivot. And the women, who are the primary earners, have very limited education because of the nature of the Haredi education system. So if a show like Shtisel can help bridge some of those gaps and open up economic opportunities, it's really performing a wonderful service. But religious secular tensions are not just about the Haredim and the secular Israeli community. There's also a lot of tensions that arise up out of that religious Zionist community over some of the concerns that secular Israelis have about the impact of religion, of Judaism, on their day-to-day life, and of course the control of the ultra-Orthodox in that case. This next clip is from the reality program Kochav Nolad, A Star is Born. It's sort of Israel's version of The Voice. It's incredibly popular. And in this clip that I'm going to show you, a young man named Yonatan Blanc, who comes from the settlement of Efrat in the Gush Etzion region of the West Bank, is planning to audition for the judges. And watch what happens.
קוראים לי יונתן בלנק, אני גר באפרת. משפחה, אחוז 6 בנים. 6? 6 בנים. יש לי חמלת אל-ג'סריה ועסניה, סלים סעדיה, מיכואל חנן חנניה, יחיה רוחם ורחמים. בטח כל פעם שאתה שומע את זה אומר לך, וואי, מסכנה אמא שלך. נכון. ברוך השם, תאומים. בינינו. איך זה לגדל 6 בנים? סבבה, ממש. כן? לא מטריפים אותך כל הבית בוץ וזה, לא? זה יותר שקט, אין הצעקות, הצלחות. תראה, נראים ילדים נורא טובים. השתדלו. הוא מוכשר? הוא מוכשר משהו. פשוט לא כאימא. כולם אומרים את זה, אבל I want to fix your shirt because your thing is coming up. Okay, they ask a lot of questions before when you get up there. So what's your plan? I have no idea. Just answer the question. You're gorgeous. So are you. You're amazing. Jonathan Blanc. שלום יונתן. שלום, מה נשמע? מה שלומך? בסדר גמור, ברוך השם. מאיפה אתה מגיע אלינו? אפרת, מגוש עציון. אתה שר? ובחייך אתה מתעסק במוזיקה, אתה כותב? אני שר מדי פעם בהרכבים בישיבה. תגיד, שאתם מופיעים בישיבה, אתם מופיעים מול בנות? או רק... לא, אנחנו רק בישיבה בנים.
ואתם מופיעים גם רק מול בנים.
כן, יש מורות לפעמים, אבל...
אבל זה לא בעייתי מבחינתך להופיע למשל כאן מול הבנות?
לא מול בנות, עם בנות זה בעיה, אבל...
לא אוהב את זה, אני לא אוהב את הדבר הזה, זה הדרת נשים בעיניי. וחבל שככה אנחנו... ככה אנחנו גדלים. ככה אנחנו גדלים.
סליחה,
זה לא קשור לאמונה.
זה אמונה של בן אדם.
ברגע שאתה פוסל מישהו
הוא
אחר,
לא פוסל.
בגלל... אתה פוסל.
הוא לא פוסל.
אתה אומר, אל תעמדי לידי, כי את אישה נקודה.
לא, תקשיב, בן אדם נולד למקום מסוים. הוא אומר לך, נשאר...
הנה את זה, אני לא מאשים אותו, אני אומר
זה
שחבל
אמונה שלו.
זה לא פייר, זה ממש לא פייר. תראה את הבן שלי.
חייבים לעלות. אנחנו כל ישראל...
תסתמו את הפה שלכם.
אני לא אוהב את זה.
הוא לא אמר שום דבר אחר, תעצרו, לא, תעצרו. לא, זה מעצבן אותי. הראל, תקשיבו טוב.
אפשר לשמוע את השיר שלו?
רגע, שנייה, מה את אומרת?
אפשר להקשיב לשיר שלו? על מה מדברים? רוצים לשמוע את השיר שלו. הדיון זה לא קשור לשיר
רגע.
לא, יש הדרת נשים בשולחן הזה, ספציפית.
חס וחלילה.
אתה שומע זמרות?
כן.
זה הכל.
שנייה,
זאת אומרת שאתה הכי אוהב?
קרן פלס.
זה הכל, לך תשיר.
Okay, for the interest of time, we're not going to listen to Yonatan sing, but he's quite good. But what you see here is a really fascinating exchange between the three judges. And of course, his mother has to get involved. Even the grandmother gets involved. And this is that tension for secular Israelis. And I should point out that Mookie, the judge who really has the hard time with this, is a very well-known left-wing Israeli rapper and hip-hop performer activist. Mookie himself is a member of the LGBTQ community. He's always promoting left-wing ideals. He famously had a song a few years back called Mazel Tov Israel, in which he basically said, congratulations, Israel, on all these great accomplishments. And all of the video that accompanied it was things that were bad with Israeli society from his perspective. And so for many Israelis, they see the double standard in terms of treatment and equality of women as stemming directly from the religious community. And so how it erupts here in this situation is really fascinating and a complete difference from what we may see on an American reality show. Just moving on, when we also talk about Jewish diversity, there's a lot of ethnic diversity within Israel's Jewish community. I have here two sort of figures for you to see. On the right, the infographic, which may be a little more difficult to see, just shows you that in Israel's first 3 years alone, when Israel was created on May 14th, 1948, its Jewish population is about 650,000. That population effectively doubles within the country's first 3 years with huge numbers of immigrants, about 663,000. And they came from 42 different countries. And despite what some of the traditional narrative is, most of those immigrants were not coming from Europe. They were actually coming from the Muslim world. They were coming from Africa and the Middle East. The largest country, for example, the largest origin of immigrants to Israel during the first decade was from Iraq, not a place that we think of today as a Jewish hotbed. And this, in turn, led to tremendous tension within Israeli society. Then you layer on, of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, the addition of 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union, many of whom were raised without Judaism, even though they were Jewish, because of the Soviet Union's restrictive practices. And of course, another 80,000 immigrants from Ethiopia. So what you have in Israel today are brown Jews, those Jews who came from the Muslim world, known in Israel as the Mizrahim or Mizrahi, from the Hebrew word Mizrach, from the east, a bit of a misnomer because Morocco, of course, is west of Israel. And then you also have the black Jews, those who came from Ethiopia, as well as white Jews. So Israel provides a real melting pot in terms of its Jewish society. And that tension between brown and white Jews in Israel's first really 30 to 35 years, and it persists in the country today, the tension between the Ashkenazi elite, those of the founders, people like Ben-Gurion and the other stalwarts of the Labor Party, all Europeans. The Zionist movement was almost entirely a European initiative, and the treatment that they provided as these brown Jews came. When the immigrants came from the Middle East and North Africa, they were almost exclusively placed into temporary transit camps in the far from the center of the country, whereas European immigrants, for the most part, were given preferential housing in the center of the country. And so what you had, and here's a quote from the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies from just a few years ago, "Yet in practice, the veteran population, mostly of European origin, was unwelcoming to the cultural and socioeconomic diversity of populations that emigrated from countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Although accepted as brethren, the leadership of the receiving society typically held paternalistic views toward these immigrant populations and hoped to mold them in their image." And it's a really fascinating dichotomy that on the one hand, the founders of Israeli society wanted to blend into the region where they were living and adopt some of the practices and customs and food specifically of these immigrants from the Middle East. But on the other hand, they wanted them to adopt other European sensibilities and culture. And a few years ago, the comedy show Hayudim Habaim, The Jews Are Coming, which is a sketch comedy show, put out a very biting satire look at how this has played out.
חברים, הקמנו מדינה, הקמנו ממשלה, ואני גאה להכריז על הישיבה הראשונה של משרד העלייה והקליטה. שיהיה בהצלחה לכולנו.
בשעה טובה, בהצלחה לנו.
שיהיה לנו בשעה טובה ובמזל טוב. אז אחרי שהבאנו לכאן את יהדות רוסיה ואת יהדות פולין, אני גאה להציג את האתגר הבא. והאתגר הבא הוא, אנחנו ניסע לאפריקה, ונביא משם בספינות את כל היהודים ממרוקו, לוב ואלג'יריה. אפריקה? אפריקה. אתה התכוונת אמריקה? אל תהיה דביל, שפיגל, היהודים מאמריקה בחיים לא הסכימו לבוא לפה. אפריקה? אפריקה.
אני דווקא חושבת שזה רעיון מצוין.
תודה רבה.
אנחנו ניסע לאפריקה. אנחנו נביא משם בספינות את כל היהודים שיש שם.
בדיוק.
ואנחנו ניתן להם לעבוד בשדות הכותנה.
רעיון מצוין. לא, מה פתאום?
בשדות הטבק.
לא, לא, לא. בשדות התירס?
במסילות הברזל.
מה פתאום? מה פתאום? מה פתאום?
אז מה אתה רוצה שהשוורצס יעשו פה?
אל תקראי להם ככה. לא קוראים לזה ככה עכשיו, קוראים לזה, החדש הזה, היהודי, אפרו-יהודים.
סליחה, אז מה אתה רוצה שהאפרו-יהודים יעשו פה?
אני מציע שלא נחליט בשבילם במה הם יעבדו. בדיוק. ניתן לבעלים שלהם להחליט. איזה בעלים? הבעלים שלהם, שקנו אותם אחרי שהבאנו אותם בספינות ומכרנו אותם. לא, אנחנו לא מוכרים אותם.
אז מה אתה רוצה, שאנחנו נשמור את כולם לעצמנו? זה יכעיס אנשים, זה לא לעניין.
לא, יאשימו אותנו בקשרי הון, שלטון, קושון. אל תקרא להם ככה.
שפיגל, סגרנו אפרו-שוורצס.
אפרו-יהודים.
אתם יודעים מה, בואו ניתן לבעלים שלהם, הם יחליטו איך קוראים להם, באמת.
לא יהיו בעלים. אני רוצה להזכיר לכם, אנחנו חיים במדינה נאורה ושוויונית. צודק. אני מציע שנחלק אותם שווה בשווה בין כולנו.
בסדר גמור. כל אחד יקבל שוורצס לפי צרכיו, ויתרום אותם כפי יכולתו.
סוציאליזם במיטבו. לא. היהודים מאפריקה יהיו אזרחים שווים במדינת ישראל. אנחנו לא מביאים אותם לכאן בשביל שהם יעבדו בשדות, או יבנו מסילות, או יקטפו טבק.
אז מה אתה רוצה שהם יעשו?
שמח!
So in this instance, the show is taking a slight, a definite fact that the Jews who came from Muslim worlds were not treated equally in Israeli society. And in fact, you can still see a lot of this today. A few years ago, the Prime Minister Netanyahu was caught in making a derogatory remark about the Mizrahi community. There still has never been a Mizrahi Prime Minister, and they've really not integrated into some of the higher elements of society. Famously, in the 1970s, they formed formed their own protest movement against this treatment in Israeli society, which they interestingly called themselves the Black Panthers, modeled after the African-American movement of the same name. And when they petitioned Golda Meir for better treatment and better opportunities for the young members of their community, they were rebuffed. And she famously said they were not nice boys. And in fact, it was that instance, it was the fact that Golda and the Labor Party really turned and didn't address the concerns of the Mizrahi community in Israel that really helped usher in the period of Likud leadership that's dominated Israeli politics since. Menachem Begin, despite being himself a Polish Jew, embraced the Mizrahi community and was a hero to them. And they voted in humongous numbers for he and Likud in 1977. So it's a really fascinating look. They take, of course, this discrimination, this treatment, and make the extreme comparison to the African-American experience of slavery. And then, of course, those of you who speak some Yiddish maybe picked up the term that they used throughout the video to refer to the African Jews, which I won't repeat, and which is in many ways a very offensive term. So the Jews are coming, which is one of the things the show was known for its really no-holds-barred attitude that nothing was too sacred to poke fun of, I think really shows a lot in terms of how this is still a stigma in Israeli society. And finally, I just want to say that the Jewish diversity in terms of the ethnic diversity is not just about that religious and secular, as I mentioned, and there's been a lot of positive developments over the last few years. One of the great interesting successes of Israel's diverse culture is a band by the name of Ewa. They're three Yemenite sisters who grew up just like many Mizrahi in the periphery, in sort of the southern part of Israel. But they've become internationally popular, and they are three Jewish Yemeni Jews who sing in Yemeni Arabic. And I'm just going to show a bit, in the interest of time, of one of their music videos. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to show the whole song, but I encourage you to listen to some of their music. And that's not what we would necessarily think of when we think of Israeli music today, but they've become very popular, not just in the country, but also around the world. So shifting now from sort of the diversity within Israel's Jewish population, I want to also now spend the last few moments we have together looking at some of that ethnic or national diversity where we started with. Remember again that we talked at the beginning that about 21% of Israel's either citizens or permanent residents are Arab or not Jewish as well. And even within the Arab community, there's tremendous diversity as well. While we tend to think of Israeli Arabs and paint them with one brush, 85% of them are Muslim. This includes, of course, the Bedouin, who are also economically marginalized in many ways. 7% of Israelis Arabs are Christian, and 8% are Druze. And the Druze live, of course, mostly in the north. And similarly with the ultra-Orthodox, with the Haredi community, the Arabs tend to live in their own communities and villages. There are about 5 different cities in Israel that are considered to be mixed cities that have somewhere between 20 to 35% Arab residents as well as Jews. But for the most part, Jews and Arabs do not integrate. And so it's really up to popular culture to help the Jewish majority understand some of the traditions and culture of Israeli Arabs. And just interestingly enough, the growth rate of the Arab population in Israel is actually ahead of the Jewish population. One of the clips that I decided not to include is a great clip from the a different comedy sketch show called Eretz Nehaderet, which is sort of Israel's Saturday Night Live, where they deal with this demographic possibility of what may Israel look like in the future. And the scene takes place at Ben Gurion Airport, and a Jewish family is not allowed to leave the country because if they do, then the Arabs will become the majority. And I also already mentioned about the separate towns. What's really fascinating, and I'm just going to breeze through a couple of public opinion polls from a few years ago, both from the Israeli Arab perspective as well as from the Israeli Jewish perspective of the Arab community. And so this first slide here is Israeli Arabs who oppose Israel's right to exist as a Jewish Zionist state. And you can see that it's remained, for the most part, fairly consistent at somewhere between 50 and 60%. Of course, the interesting dip here down to 34%, you'll notice is in 1995, in the years immediately after the Oslo Accords. And so that was a period where there was a bit of hope that there may become a Palestinian state. Again, Israeli Arabs who oppose Israel's right to exist. These are citizens of the country. And it's been, again, fairly relatively consistent, and in recent years, hovering somewhere between 20 and 25%. On the flip side, Israeli Jews who are not ready to have an Arab friend, also around somewhere close to 30% of Israeli Jews have said this. And I think a lot of this is because, again, that they don't necessarily interact. They don't serve in the IDF together. They don't necessarily live together, and they may not work together. Again, Israeli Jews who are opposed to any kind of Arab minority in Israel. It's a small number, but it's relatively significant. It's 15%. The next clip I want to show you is from one of my favorite Israeli television shows of the last 15 years, a show called Avodah Aravi, Arab Labor. The show was created by author Sayed Kashua, himself an Israeli Arab. And what's interesting about Kashua is that he writes, he's one of the few, or was one of the first Israeli Arabs to write predominantly in Hebrew. And so Kashua opened opportunities for Israelis to understand more about Arab society. And the show is semi-autobiographical. The main character, whose name is Amjad, he'll be the guy, the older gentleman in the glasses in the clip I'm about to show you, is really a semi-autobiographical sketch of Kashua himself. Amjad is a journalist who's committed, if you've seen the show, to showing that Arabs and Jews really can integrate. They just need to find ways to cooperate and integrate together. He's committed to that integration. And in the clip I'm about to show you, to prove the integration, he decides to go onto the television show Big Brother, the reality show. We have it here in the United States. It's very popular in Israel as well. And the concept of the show, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a bunch of random people are forced to live in a house together and try to get along. In the clip, when Amjad goes on Big Brother, the producers tell him, don't tell everyone in the house that you're Arab. And instead, they tell everyone living in the Big Brother house, one of the house members is an Arab, and the contest is to try to figure out who it is. Everyone in the house immediately begins to suspect not Amjad, the actual Arab, but a different house member who himself is a Mizrahi Jew. So again, it brings in some of that complexity, and it's just really fascinating to watch the interplay between them. It's not a great clip because I copied it from my TV with my phone. It was the only way I could get it, but it's really good. So this is Itzik. He's the Mizrahi that everyone in the house assumes is the Arab. That's Amjad. He's the actual Arab and the main character.
אנשים, אבל לפחות רואים את הפרצוף האמיתי שלהם.
רגע, לא, איזה פרצוף אמיתי? אתם לא יכולים לשפוט לפי בן אדם אחד, כן?
אחד? זה עם שלם, זו תרבות, ככה מחנכים אותם. אני צודק. אין מה לעשות, הם חושבים אחרת. אין מה לעשות. צודק, תשמע, אני לא... תקשיב, אני מכירה ערבים, יאנו, אני אומרת לך, אני עבדתי עם שנים ערבים, ואף פעם לא הייתה לי בעיה עם הזה. אבל מה, אתה מבין זאת בקומה? לא כולה, כמו בכל עם, יש טובים, יש רעים.
אני יודע איך בן אדם במצבך צריך להיות. תאמין לי. אז מה אתה מציע? פשוט תנסה להיעלם. אל תבלוט. אתה לא חייב גם להגיד מה שאתה חושב כל הזמן. אני יודע שזה אתה, אני יודע, אבל אני אומר לך, תנסה לזרום, תנסה לפנק אותם, לעזור, להיות חיובי כל הזמן. כן. אמרת שאתה רוצה לפתוח מסעדה, נכון? אז תבשל להם. איזה רעיון. לא, באמת, אתה חייב להפסיק להיות חשוב כל הזמן. חשוב. תנסה לא להיות. שאתה לא שם. לא שמים לב, אתה מבין? זה עוברים. איציק חדש הקמת. מה נראה לך? לך שפת הדרום? רק תן להם לנקי קטנים צוחקים.
That's Amjad's family watching the show at home. Makluba is a Middle Eastern lamb dish. Of course, they asked the Arab to do the kiddush.
אבל תוריד את הספר, כן? תוריד את הספר. מה? איציק? אתה לא חושב שאתה עובר כאן את הגבול?
מה קרה? מה עשיתי?
לא, זה פשוט חוצפה. זאת חוצפה, כאילו, מה לא עשינו בשביל לקבל לך כאן באמת? מה? את כל האלה אתה רוצה? כבוד מינימלי למקום הזה שאתה חי בו, נניח. אין לך? שנייה. לא, אני רוצה להבין. שנייה, איציק. עם כל הכבוד לאוכל שלך, הבית הזה יהודי וכך הוא יישאר. אני אגיד לך מה, במקום להגיד תודה, במקום להגיד לך שאנחנו את הידיים ואת הרגליים, לא טוב לך, תלך. 22 שנות יש לך ללכת אליהם יחד ודודה.
And I'll stop it here. But again, I want to point out two things that I think are really fascinating about this. And remember again that this show was created by an Arab Israeli. But on the one hand, what's the advice that the actual Arab gives to the guy that everyone suspects is an Arab? Blend in, don't stand out so much. Try to sublimate your culture, your personality, and then maybe they'll accept you. And then, of course, the reactions from these two women in the house of disgust when he touches them, and this idea that how dare you try to be equal to me. And this is a real tension in Israeli society. And I think it really is something that the country is going to have to sort of deal with at some point in the future. Again, just to show you, this is a survey done of Arab Israelis, specifically young Arab Israelis to the age of 30. when it asks what issue most concerns you and your family, you can see the issue of Palestinian issues, not the most important issue. What do they care about? They care about the racism that exists in Israeli society. They care about the economy. They don't have the same access to some of the economic advantages that the Jewish population has. They do care about equality. They care about personal security. So it's the very direct things that they care about. And this next video, and I have just two more slides left, so we're almost to the end. This next video is the most contemporary, it's the most recent. One of the things that has been interesting to track over the last 3 elections has been the turnout of the Arab population. And this really started in 2015 with the elections for the Knesset that took place that year, when for the first time 4 Arab parties ran together as a joint list. And they actually won the most seats that they had ever won. But what was really interesting in the 3 elections that we just had, in the April 2019 election, Arab turnout was just under 50%. In the September election, it rose to 59%. And in this last round, the March election, it was 65%. And what's really fascinating is what that impact has had. Remember, they're 20% of the population in Israel. Of the voting population, yet they've never represented 20% of the seats in the Knesset. This turnout was the highest it's ever been. And the clip I want to show you is from an Arab Israeli or a Palestinian Israeli hip hop artist named Tamir Nofar. And this is a music video that he put out in April of 2019, just before the first of the 3 elections. And the name of the song is Tamir Must Vote. And what you'll notice in watching the video is the video itself in the song is an actual dialogue between the singer and himself, arguing on the one hand, if I don't vote, if I don't participate, how will we ever be considered equal part of this society, and how can we ever make a difference and change? But on the other hand, if I do vote, I'm basically agreeing and subjugating myself to the Jewish majority and their policies that continue to keep our population down. So let's take a look.
سيداتي سادتي, ladies and gentlemen, معنا هون اليوم فيش خسران. التنين في نفس الحلبة في نفس الطريق مع بعض ماشيين. خلونا.
The fascist, of course, for him is Netanyahu. I'm sorry, I was trying to get rid of the bar that's covering the subtitles.
بيبي مستغلوني طيبين وليبرالية شوفوا غير يا بيبي الديمقراطية السوائية احنا في زمن ترامب والفاشية لغة المينستريم فصوتك ما بيكفي الأغلبية عنصرية خسرنا فكركني لا أدخل حرب صواريخ وبإيدنا سكين لا أدخل حرب دبابات وبإيدنا حجر هيك احنا مبنيين صمدين بقول ليش رح نحرر فلسطين بس إذا صوتنا ممكن يحذف ليبرمانيز جنبيبي فاحنا جاهزين.
So again, I'm not going to show the whole song, but this concept, and you can see the issues that he's wrestling with. If I vote, I'm supporting the country and my taxes that go to put missiles in Gaza on my Palestinian brethren. But if I don't vote, then Bibi, who he considers a fascist, or Lieberman, who he considers a racist, will remain in power. So I want to end, the last slide is to a bit of an interesting, hopeful note that's just from the last few days. And it relates to the impact of the coronavirus. And this is a survey that was just done by the Jewish People Policy Institute. And what's interesting is they asked the non-Jewish population of Israel, how would they define themselves as either a Palestinian or an Israeli? And what's fascinating here is the blue bar is 2019 and the gray is the current. And you see this tremendous shift that's happened over the past few weeks, where more and more non-Jewish Israelis feel that they are Israeli. And this is the direct result, most analysts think, of Israel and the coronavirus. The coronavirus doesn't care if you're Palestinian, Jewish, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, it's brought out the cooperation elements of Israeli society. Arab doctors and Jewish doctors working alongside each other in the hospitals to treat patients and improve the society. And so it's really fascinating to end on this sort of potential uplifting note that a crisis like we've been dealing with could actually be something that helps to unify Israeli society. So thank you for allowing me to provide this little window. I'm gonna turn it back to Dana, who I think will moderate some questions.
So Rich, this was fascinating. Thank you so much. You really gave us a window into the diversity of Israel, and we appreciate it. I think in the interest of time, we are going to not take Q&A today, but I want to tell everybody who's listening that if you have questions, email them to us. We will get them to Rich. We will get you back the answers, and we really appreciate your flexibility on that. So again, Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I feel like we were really educated in a different way on the diversity in Israel. We appreciate your time. To everybody else, look for an email with additional meaningful ways to connect with our Federation and our Jewish community during these unprecedented times, including how you can make a difference for those in need by contributing to our annual campaign. Watch for our next Federation live event about the Broadway musical Hamilton on November 18th with Robert Watson. And together with our caring community, we thrive, stay safe, be well, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.